So we can get started. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today for our press conference to discuss and unveil some exciting new research indicating in a less exciting way that Black borrowers in Atlanta are at the center of the city's student debt crisis. And we'll overview what that means, how it interacts with the president's relief programs, and more. I'm Jackie Filson. I'm the head of communications for the Student Borrower Protection Center. Before we get started and hear from our speakers, I'm just going to quickly share our agenda for the call, and I'll give an overview of how the press Q&A will work so folks know. And I also just want to note that this press conference will be recorded. And also closed captions should be available. You just need to click the show captions button at the bottom of your Zoom window. But if anyone has any other technical difficulties during this call, you should be able to shoot us a message in the chat and we'll do our best to help out. So for the agenda today, we'll start by hearing opening remarks from Kat Welbeck of the Student Borrower Protection Center. She's our Director of Advocacy and the Civil Rights Council. She has a wealth of knowledge on the subject, as well as a ton of expertise coming from the CFPB's office and actually teaching in public schools herself, and so much more. So she'll give us a review of the findings of the report that we're releasing. And then we will move into hearing remarks from the rest of our lovely speakers. And then after that, that's when we'll open it up for questions from press. So the way that will work, it'll function the way that it usually does. We'll ask that reporters use the raise hand button on Zoom to verbally ask questions, and then I will call on you and you'll be unmuted and we'll be able to ask your question. But you can also feel free to ask questions in the chat and then I can read them aloud and we'll do our best to answer them. So with that, we can get started. Thank you again for joining us, and I will hand it off to Kat.
Thanks so much, Jackie. Good morning, everyone. Again, like Jackie said, I'm Kat Welbeck. And so first, I just want to thank you all so much for joining us this morning, echoing Jackie's remarks, but also really thank New Georgia Project for co-hosting this press event with us. We're just so thrilled to talk about this research, but also so grateful for our partners at New Georgia Project for really highlighting the experiences of student loan borrowers in Atlanta and across the state of Georgia that also really amplify a lot of the work that we're trying to do with this report. So a little bit of background on this report. One thing that we want to do at the Student Borrower Protection Center is use research to really talk about and highlight the lived experiences of student loan borrowers all across our country. So we've embarked on this research series, Student Debt in the South, to really look at the geography of student debt, but specifically in the geographic South, and look at what does student debt look like at the neighborhood level. So we know about larger patterns about racial disparities and the student debt crisis, but really want to take a granular look at that and see what it looks like in the community. So the first in this report series is focused on Atlanta. And so I'm going to share my screen to do a quick PowerPoint to highlight some of the findings from this report. And let me see if you all are able to see the screen. Sorry, I'll stop that really quick. If you're able to see the PowerPoint, apologies for this. All right, there we go. Okay, so to start, one thing we've seen with this report, we start off with what has happened with student debt in Atlanta broadly in the past decade or so. So this report uses credit panel data that we use from the University of California Consumer Credit Panel data, and it looks at, again, the student debt across Atlanta specifically, but then at the neighborhood level. So we start with from the period of the Great Recession all the way through the payment pause through about 2020. And we see that across the board, we see rising levels of student debt in Atlanta. And that's something consistent with what we've seen nationally. So with the Great Recession, what we saw is a less public investment in higher education, a decrease in household wealth, because again, many households losing personal wealth during the Great Recession, but also at that same time, so with less public investment in higher education, a decline in household wealth, we saw a lot of the burden of financing higher education shift to families. And so we actually see that in Atlanta over this period of time. But one thing to note, especially, and one thing, as Jackie mentioned, is a focal point of this research is that in addition to these rising levels of student debt that we see in Atlanta, across the country, what we really see is specifically this really affecting Black student loan borrowers, Black households, and Black communities. And so one really quick note before we get into some of this data and explaining why we see this, and this is something we talk about in the report, is because of the racial wealth gap in our country, we see that Black families, Latino families have a fraction of the wealth of white families and of white families' household wealth. And so what that results is when it's time for students to go to college to pay for school, typically Black student loan borrowers, Latino student loan borrowers have less familial wealth to contribute towards their education. So we actually see Black students borrowing debt at about 90%, as compared to about 66% of white student loan borrowers. So we see higher levels of borrowing for Black students. Likewise, we see higher levels of borrowing for Latino students. And so what happens is, so we see that Black students, in the case of this research, are more likely to take out loans, borrow in higher amounts, and so leave school with more debt. And so that cuts into wealth building opportunities over their lifetime. And that's something we see across Atlanta. And so while we see increase in more students going to college, we also see significantly higher balances for Black student loan borrowers over that same period of time. And not only are we seeing that Black student loan borrowers have higher balances, but we also see that they're growing more quickly. So we see, again, people are going to school, trying to attain higher education, seeking the social mobility, but at the same time, we're seeing that student loan debt is really a significant barrier to opportunities and economic mobility over that same period of time. And so as a result, we also see, in addition to higher balances, we see more struggles in repayment. So through the research, we see not only are Black borrowers borrowing more, we see there's more distress in terms of delinquency and default when student loan borrowers fall behind on their loans. And then talking about student loan debt cutting into wealth building opportunities. And in addition to having higher debt balances, having struggles in repayment, we also see that student debt is affecting people's mortgage attainment. So even when we look at zip codes, majority Black zip codes versus majority white zip codes, we see that there's actually even less mortgage attainment in majority Black zip codes when we make that comparison for student loan borrowers. One thing of note, though, that we saw in this research is during the payment pause, so this research spanned 2010 through 2020. So we got part of the COVID payment pause. And so one thing what we did see is, though, even though we saw higher levels of distress for Black student loan borrowers over this period of time, we actually saw that delinquency rates for borrowers in majority Black neighborhoods actually dropped significantly during this period. And so one thing that's really important to point to is talking about how significant and important debt relief is. And so we're going to talk a little bit about what this means for President Biden's larger debt cancellation plan. We talk about policies to reduce the student loan balances, to reduce payments. So thinking about what student loan relief can actually look like, looking at this data during the period of the payment pause really shows us that reprieve actually did help borrowers in terms of reducing delinquency and default. But one thing that's important to talk about is, again, going back to how deeply systemic student debt issues are and how deeply they're tied to wealth, how deeply they're tied to the racial wealth gap. Because even though we saw a reduction in delinquency and default, one thing that we still continue to see during the payment pause is that we saw still, when we looked at majority Black neighborhoods, we saw a larger number of borrowers who had what we call runaway balances. So these are essentially student loan borrowers who have non-amortizing loans. So they might be repaying their loans for years and years and years and be in repayment, but not actually see the actual balance drop. And when we think about what that means for long-term economic mobility, what does it mean to be able to buy a home, to save for retirement? to start a business, all these other measures of economic opportunity. What does it mean to be making a payment every single month, but not actually seeing that balance decrease? And so other things, again, just another chart from the report showing what that actually looks like and how we see that significantly more borrowers in majority Black neighborhoods who have these non-declining balances. And then also just really quickly, and Aissa is going to talk some more about the legal and legislative efforts challenging debt relief. Again, going back to seeing the fact that we saw a decline in borrower distress during the payment pause. And so again, presumably looking at the potential for President Biden's debt relief plan, looking at the potential for other programs that the president has other student loan relief programs that the president has tried to improve during this administration, really being able to see how far and how broad this relief can go, how life-changing it can be for student loan borrowers, but realizing there are some efforts to challenge the potential of this relief. And so one thing we also want to look at and try to quantify is, what does this look like in terms of dollar amount, and what does this look like across neighborhoods for what potential this relief could have, but also looking at the fact that that's currently being challenged. So thank you so much for your time. I'm going to hand it off to Aissa, who's going to talk a little bit more about these challenges.
Thank you so much, Kat. And thank you all for joining us today to talk about this critical report. My name is Aissa Canchola Banyas. I am a senior advisor for policy and strategy with the Student Borrower Protection Center. And as Kat had mentioned, today's report really comes at a critical time for so many millions of borrowers across the country. 40 million borrowers are left waiting for a decision from the Supreme Court on the fate of President Biden's debt relief program. And for so many, this decision will really determine whether they have the chance at that economic freedom that they've been promised from the crushing weight of student debt. And as Kat perfectly alluded, and as the report perfectly lays out, that the promise of that economic freedom just weighs so much more heavily within Black and Brown communities in which the student debt crisis has disproportionately fallen hardest on. And so, for millions of folks, they are left waiting to really kind of see if they will have the chance at the financial stability, the chance to purchase a home, to start a small business and build generational wealth. And really what this comes down to is whether or not they will have a chance to not just survive and to get by, but to actually thrive and see the chance of building generational wealth for themselves and for their families. So across the country, 26 million borrowers applied for the chance at this economic freedom following President Biden's announced student debt relief program last summer. And 16 million have been formally approved for the relief and are now waiting for the Supreme Court to follow the letter of the law and uphold President Biden's legal debt relief plan. There are tens of millions of borrowers and their families, including 642,000 folks across Georgia, and more than 57,000 in the Atlanta metro region alone that are caught in this economic limbo. So just really kind of putting the numbers into context about how this really kind of falls within the context of Georgia wealth building and economic mobility for folks across predominantly Black neighborhoods in across the Atlanta metro region. Many of whom, as Kat had said, have only seen their balances grow over the course of the crisis and really saw the payment pause as an opportunity to kind of make ends meet, pay down other debt loads, and keep roofs over their heads over the course of the pandemic. And so we're really able to really benefit and see economic relief through the student loan payment pause. And at the same time, while millions of folks are waiting for kind of to learn the fate of debt relief through President Biden's promised program, there now is a new effort in Congress to use the Congressional Review Act to overturn both the student loan payment pause and to block President Biden's debt relief plan. And should these efforts be successful, 37 million borrowers across the country would be impacted, and tens of millions of folks would be abruptly forced back into repayment. What this means for real folks and in real life is that it could add thousands of dollars in payments and interest back onto folks' student loan balances. So the same folks that finally saw reprieve over the payment pause and have been able to kind of get back on their feet could see several months of payments added back into their student loan balances. And in Georgia alone, over 1.3 million borrowers would be forced back into abrupt repayment. These efforts could also force the Department of Education to literally unwind progress that folks have earned towards public service loan forgiveness. These are benefits that have been earned over the course of the payment pause as well by public service workers. We're talking about nurses, educators, first responders, many of the same folks who have been our frontline workers over the course of the pandemic, helped us get through, the brunt of the health and, economic havoc that has resulted from the public health crisis, that could literally see progress kind of rolled back as a result of the Congressional Review Act effort. And as a result, over 100,000 public service workers, including more than 7,000 in Georgia, could see forgiveness revoked and their loans reinstated. And so, one of the things that we really aim, as Kat had mentioned at the top, is to really use research and data to underscore the real world impact of the student debt crisis, but also attacks on student loan borrowers, what they mean for real people, and in the communities that have been most on the front lines bearing the brunt of this crisis for far too long. And so today's report is a reminder of the communities that have the most to gain from student debt relief, and unfortunately have the most to lose should these efforts to attack student loan borrowers be successful. And so behind every single one of these numbers that we've thrown out today are individual borrowers, their parents, grandparents, caretakers that know firsthand the economic and emotional toll of this debt, and is why reports like these are more than just about data points, but rather an opportunity to uplift the individuals and communities directly impacted. So with that, I will turn it back to Jackie so that we can hear from borrowers themselves. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Aisa. Thanks for driving home what the data we're discussing actually means for people and borrowers in Atlanta. And as she said, now I'm going to hand it off to an incredible person, an actual Atlanta resident, and also the Chief Development Officer at our partners at New Georgia Project, Candace Drummond. Candace just amazingly had $175,000 of her student debt canceled through the Federal Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program, which was created to help ensure that anyone who serves in our communities doesn't face the lifelong burden of student debt. So with that, Candace, please take it away.
Thank you, Jackie. As Jackie said, my name is Candace Drummond. I am the Chief Development Officer at the New Georgia Project, but today, and more importantly, I am here as a Black Atlanta resident who just had $175,000 in student loan debt forgiven because of the Biden administration public student loan waiver opportunity. I am a proud graduate of Georgia State and Johns Hopkins University. I come from a military family, so I moved around a lot as a child, but landed in Atlanta for a high school where my father is from and chose to retire. As a first-generation college student, I had to take out federal student loans to attend college because my parents did not know the first thing about preparing me for college other than pushing me to be the best student possible. At 17, I completed my own college applications in the FAFSA form. To this day, my parents have never reviewed a financial aid package with me or even know how much I took out to complete my degree. Like many first gens, I had to become independent very quickly. However, the importance of my education was instilled in me as a young child because my parents wanted better for me. So after I completed my undergrad degree, I continued on to get my master's, but still needed to take out more federal student loans because I was also a single mother at the time. Since graduating, I spent my entire career working in the nonprofit sector because it aligns with my values, but also because of the public student loan forgiveness program. My husband, a Black man also living in Atlanta, has a significant amount of student loan debt due to getting his law school degree too. He has also chosen a career working in the federal government to get the same debt relief I am seeking through the public student loan forgiveness program. Early in my career, I made a decision to consolidate my loans because I thought it would be better for my financial security. However, I didn't find out until years later when I read a news article about the number of applicants rejected from the public student loan forgiveness program, that my consolidation would mean that all my payments before the consolidation wouldn't count. I was shocked to read the number of penalties that would disqualify a payment. Until then, I thought solely making a payment made it qualifying. Like many others, I knew then that my public student loan forgiveness journey was in jeopardy. My loans have always felt like a burden to me, but that burden became even more real this year when it was time for my daughter to start college. I tried to do everything I could, but she didn't have to take out loans for her education, but that was nearly impossible. Last summer, during a financial aid appointment, I found out that a new rule put in place stated that students can only take out a little over $5,000 a year in federal student loans for their education, and everything else was the parents' responsibility. Even though I'm glad future generations might not face the federal student loan debt that I have, but now my generation who is deeply in debt has the burden of carrying even more debt for their children to go to college. On top of what I already owe for my education, upon my daughter's graduation, I'll owe another $80,000. After this, and this is after her scholarships and her own personal federal student loans that she took out. Then on top of this, I have a toddler in daycare that costs me and my husband close to $2,000 a month, and I have a third child on the way. You think that being married and having a dual income household would make paying for these very reasonable and regular expenses of having a family and owning a home easier. But we've made it this far because we're financially careful, and because we both chose careers that would help us most likely get our loans forgiven. In fact, without the recent payment pauses, we probably would have not considered having a third child because we couldn't have afforded it. The bottom line is that having this much debt to get my education has been incredibly stressful and has played a huge factor in my life choices for my husband and I. From how many kids we have to when we buy our home and where we can afford to live. Having my loans forgiven through the public student loan forgiveness program means that my husband and I can enjoy our lives more freely. We can afford all of the American dream type of things that was promised to me with getting my college education. If my debt is reinstated because of the Congressional Review Act resolutions, we'll have to face these challenges all over again. As a Black woman living in the South, I faced enough barriers to my progress, and my desire to get a college education 20 years ago should not be one of those. So thank you for listening to my story, and I'm shooting it back to Jackie.
Thank you so much, Candace, for being willing to share your story and even speak to similar experiences from your family and friends, and hammering home exactly how student debt and student debt relief actually plays out in lives like yours and your family's. And so next up, we're so lucky to get to hear another story. And it's my pleasure to introduce Tamron Davis, who is an Albany State University undergraduate student. And she is also a student loan borrower who grew up in the Metro Atlanta area. So Tamron, over to you.
Hi, good morning, everybody. I am Tamron Davis, like she said, and I am a native from the Metro Atlanta area. I'm a 21-year-old health and human performance at the unsinkable, the indestructible Albany State University, which is located in Albany, Georgia. My experience at ASU has been nothing but a blessing for me. I serve as a mental health and suicide prevention awareness ambassador, basically just cultivating diverse initiatives to increase student morale within the overall community. I'm really about just changing the conversation about mental health, how it's cared for, and also how it's valued in my community. My time here at Albany State just allowed me to be in spaces where I'm also being a peer leader, but I'm also taking care of the community as well. So I organized a rally just to raise awareness about sexual assault. And for my 21st birthday, I thought about just giving back last month, since it was Women's History Month, and just giving back to the Black and Brown women in my community just by having hygiene products and clothing for them as well. So they wouldn't have to worry about it. All these things I accomplished here at Albany State University comes with a price. Currently, I am $11,000 in student loan debt. It's the most frustrating time of the year. Filling out my FAFSA, because not only I actually had to take student loan debt out of his name just to be able just to push me through school, because I am a first generational graduate student, and also I'm a Black woman in the Atlanta metro area, so it's known for us to borrow money as well. So being that I am from a single household and coming from being the first generational college student, it's a great thing, but also it just comes with a price as well, because it's kind of saying like, is my degree worth all the troublings after paying all this money off? And also within my major, I'm going to have to go and get my master's degree as well. So unfortunately, I'm going to just have to keep borrowing student loan debt. But if it was relieved, it would just take a lot of pressure off my father and myself as well. Also, he is 50 years old. So, at that time, I really want to make sure that he retires and not have to stress about anything. But the fact that I do have student loan debt under his name and also my name, like, it's kind of like he has to go and pay for the things and not enjoy his life for his own. So thank you for hearing my story, and I do appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Tamron. I'm so grateful that we got to hear from you. It's stories like yours and Candace's that really ground the work that we're doing. And it helps ensure that we all don't get lost in the data and the numbers, and we keep borrowers front of mind, because that's what and who is leading this work. So that's my segue to our final wonderful speaker, Maggie Bell. Maggie is the lead organizer for New Georgia Project's Cancel Loans for Education and Reparations campaign. She's also a Metro Atlanta native, a proud graduate of Albany State University, and a student loan borrower herself. So Maggie, handing it to you.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everybody. I am Maggie Bell with New Georgia Project. I'm the lead organizer for the CLEAR campaign. And again, CLEAR stands for Canceling Loans for Education and Reparations. I am also a first generation college graduate. I currently owe over $30,000 of federal student loan debt. So being on the ground and doing this work, I am an impacted person, and I take it like super personal because this affects me, right? So we launched the CLEAR campaign last year. And we launched it because we prioritize hearing the voices of young Georgians across the state and found out that student loan debt is one of their major concerns. So the campaign demands that Black and Brown borrowers see full cancellation of student debt to move the needle forward for education reform, but we also see cancellation as a form of reparations for our community. We are very blunt and adamant about this demand. Like, we want to see 100% of our student loans canceled. In the past year, we've organized an HBCU tour where we went across the state and educated and engaged over 500 college students, but also faculty and staff about cancellation of student loan debt. We mobilized 45 Black and Brown borrowers to travel to DC with us, where we rallied outside of the White House and the Department of Education. And then we did it again this year when we mobilized 40 Black borrowers to come back with us and rally outside of SCOTUS during the hearing. And so we are literally like, we're not going anywhere. We are adamant about how student loan debt affects us, and we're going to show up and show out every opportunity that we have. Our message and our purpose remains the same. We're young people in the South. We have something to say, and we want our student loan debt canceled. We are currently living in an unaffordable environment that's not getting better with time or patience. So the time is now to cancel our student loan debt. The burden is affecting Black borrowers, like we just learned. The burden is affecting Black borrowers. who are still facing other financial disparities and hardships, other health, economic, and career hardships. And we continue to get the short end of the stick. It's something that we have to talk about. It's an issue that if we don't talk about it, it's going to continue to happen. And so we're going to keep working on this no matter like what SCOTUS says, what comes back. We have to advocate and work on getting our student loans cleared. And so, like Kat mentioned today, you know, we make payments on these balances and we don't see the balance change. That's real, and that's an issue. How can we continue to move forward? And we know that this is an issue. We have so much data and statistics proving that this is an issue for Black and brown borrowers, and nobody's going to do anything about it? Absolutely not. As far as speaking for the people who have power, absolutely not. That's not okay. And so we're extremely grateful for Student Borrower Protection Center for compiling this data, because it truly reflects how student loan debt is affecting people in Atlanta, but specifically Black borrowers in Atlanta, Black borrowers in the South. And so we will continue to have these conversations across the state with those who are impacted, with those who are in power, because we all have a role in this movement. We're going to keep applying pressure to those who have the power, and we want to see some movement around this. We want to see our student loan debt cleared. So thank you so much, and I'm going to pass it back to Jackie.
Yay, thank you. Thank you, Maggie, for speaking and for all the hard work that you do every day for this movement and making clear how many people in Georgia specifically are behind and in support of this work. We know that student debt cancellation is popular. We know that it's necessary, and that's why we're all here. So with that, we can open it up for questions from press. As I mentioned, reporters, you can either click the raise hand button and then I will call on you and we'll unmute you so you can ask your question verbally, or you can submit questions in the chat and I will read them aloud. So I'll give it a second for folks to process. Right. So to start us off, we've got a question for you, Candace. I think you spoke to this a little bit in your intro and during your remarks, but if you can elaborate, folks are wondering, how has living in Atlanta specifically impacted how you were thinking and how you have been thinking about your student loan debt?
So I'm from Atlanta, but I had left Atlanta when I went to DC to do my graduate degree. And that's where I met my husband. My husband is from DC, loves DC, and wants to raise our children closer to his family in DC. But until his student loans are forgiven, we kind of feel like Atlanta makes the most sense for us as a family, because DC would just be unaffordable with the debt that he is carrying with his student loans right now too.
Thank you. Yeah. That's really important. Okay. Another question that we've got, this one is for you, Tamron. So you and Candace both mentioned Parent Plus loans and spoke to that a bit. Folks are wondering, how have the loans your dad had to take out to help pay for your college education impact your family? So I think they just want to hear a little bit more about that.
All right, thank you all for that question. It has impacted my family tremendously. Honestly, my father is having to withhold some of his dreams and aspirations just to make sure that I can do what I needed to do, which is being in college, making sure that I'm taken care of, making sure that I have all like the things I need, which is toothbrushes, toothpastes, toiletry, everything down to the little things. So he's having to withhold some of the things that he wants to do which is vacationing, which is actually like just thinking about retirement. And honestly, right now we actually live in an apartment in Atlanta. He's holding back from getting a house. So those are the things that like kind of like hurt me in a sense, but drive me in a sense to making sure that my degree is not only just for me, but it's also for the people that poured into me, which is my father and my grandmother and the teachers that told me that, you know, you're able to do something greater, far more than what your parents have done, but just take it and run with it. So that's my answer to that.
That's a great answer. Thank you. It looks like Joe Ripley, you had your hand raised. So if you still want to ask a question, we are going to unmute you. Oh, it looks like you just actually put it in the chat. So I will read that aloud. So Joe's question: was the study able to track how much total student loan debt is carried in Georgia and what the breakdown among African Americans is, and what are down practical solutions to provide relief, not counting payment pause extension or cancellation? So Kat, can you speak to this question?
For sure. And thanks so much, Joe, for your question. That's a really great question. So this report was focused just on Metro Atlanta. So this report specifically does not have total student loan debt that's carried in Georgia, but we do have other resources where we have like state-based estimates on student debt across the state. But also in terms of how we were actually able to track race-based data is we used credit panel data, and we were then able to overlay zip codes. And so we approximated race by the racial composition of zip codes, because unfortunately we live in a deeply segregated society. So we were able to approximate race. And that's why a lot of the report we talk about majority Black neighborhoods, majority white neighborhoods, because we don't have student loan data by race, but we are able to approximate it based on the racial composition of the zip codes. And I'm trying to make sure I get to the last part of your question, is also, what are some of the practical solutions? So this paper specifically talks about the payment pause and cancellation, specifically because of like the direct threats to debt cancellation. But in a lot of our other work, we do talk about the importance of creating pathways to debt relief. And so that's also a larger part of our policy and advocacy work, is making sure that the existing programs that we have work and are improved in a way to make sure that student loan debt is not a lifelong sentence. So making sure that IDR plans are actually affordable and people have access to them, that when people default, they're not just subject to really predatory and wealth extracting forms of wage garnishment and debt collection. So we're pushing for policies like Fresh Start at the Department of Education. So while this report doesn't directly talk about those programs, that is a larger part of our work to make sure those work. And Ais is here, who can also probably chime in somewhere there too.
Oh yeah, no, great points made, and agree with them wholeheartedly, Kat. I would also add, so while the report doesn't specifically hone in on the level of student debt across Georgia, we do have resources that that provide that information. But so Joe, if you're interested in getting your hands on some of those, feel free to reach out to us, and we can leave our email addresses in the chat. But just like at a high level across the state of Georgia, there are over 1.6 million federal student loan borrowers that owe an accumulated $70.7 billion in student across the state. So definitely a huge number. And within that, 18.2 billion of that is specifically owed by older borrowers in particular. So when we're talking about not just the racial justice implications, like this is having an intergenerational impact on our seniors in particular, impacting families such as, Candace's, on just trying to think through how they're going to take on another, level of student debt. But also to Tamron's point about her father not being able to kind of imagine retirement and planning towards retirement. So definitely wanted to point out those numbers, and we'd be happy to share this fact sheet if you're interested in learning more.
Thank you both. I'm hoping that answered. We had another question in the chat about the data. So I'm hoping that addressed that. And we've also had a couple of questions just about the report. Yes, it is publicly available now, and we will send it around. And I think I should be able to post the link in the chat, but if not, we'll make sure that everyone that joined this call gets it. And it'll also be on all of our websites. So yeah. Next, I will hand it to Annie to answer one of our other questions in the chat from Janelle.
Oh, thank you so much. I answered it in the Q&A box.
Oh, great. Sorry, I missed that.
All good.
Cool. Okay, I'm just checking to see if we've got any other questions that I've missed or any hands raised. Okay. So we've got a question for you, Maggie. New Georgia Project is obviously very well known for your voter engagement and voting rights work. So folks are wondering how and why you got into organizing around student debt cancellation and where the link is there.
Oh my goodness, yes. As a young person, I understand how my presence, my votes, my major concerns play a role in like what my future is going to look like, and people who look like me, like what our future is going to look like. And so when it comes to canceling student loan debt, that's a real conversation that we have to have, because there are people who we elect, there are people who are appointed, who have the power to make these changes that we want to see for our future. And if we're not a part of the conversation, if we just let things slide, we are going to fall through the cracks when these people who have power are gone, long gone, right? And so, again, like I mentioned earlier, the time is now for us to have this conversation and see some change around student loan debt. The time is now for young people to be understanding the power that you have by using your voice and sharing your experiences and testimony about how things affect you now, how you see them affecting you later. And let's have that conversation, right? So elections tie in with student loan debt forgiveness. We have to have the right people in power who make these decisions. Because if we don't, if we're not a part of the electoral process, and we don't vote for those people who share the same values, who care about the things that we care about, we're not going to be represented, right? And so if you are someone who has student loan debt, or even if you're somebody who doesn't have student loan debt, but you see the issue, we have to speak up now. We have to be a part of the political process to see change now and for our future.
Yes. Maggie, is there like any specific ways that folks can get involved in the CLEAR campaign that you're working on?
Yes. So we actually have a webpage, and I can drop the link in the chat. I just dropped it now. But the webpage shares more about our CLEAR campaign. It also has a petition, because of course we want to make sure that if you identify with our campaign, you sign this petition to show unity. And so everybody who signs the petition, they get a call back. We want to hear about your story. We want to see how is this debt impacting you, so that, maybe if you're not someone who is, activist ready, because not everybody is, or even if you are, New Georgia Project is a political home for you. The CLEAR campaign is a home for you to share your story and advocate for change around this.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Yeah, I hope everyone does. And it looks like we've got one more question. This one's for you, Aisa. And I think this is a good one for us to end it on, unless anyone has a final question that they want to post in the chat or anything like that. So Aisa, what is the likelihood that congressional efforts to overturn the payment pause and the president's debt relief plan will be successful?
That's a great question. Thank you for that, Jackie. I think the way we see things like this for Student Borrower Protection Center is like, we cannot take anything for granted. I think efforts by members of Congress to use the Congressional Review Act to overturn payment pause and President Biden's debt relief need to be taken seriously. Obviously, you know, in the House with the Republican majority, it is likely that it's possible that this could pass. And so, you know, I think for us, we are doing everything that we can to educate folks on the impact of this potential legislation and really just hone in on the human impact that it will have on millions of borrowers across the country. So we are certainly not you know, taking anything for granted here and are just making it a point to continue to elevate folks' stories and educate folks on the impact of this legislation. So yeah, I think I'll leave it there.
That's perfect. Yeah, that's exactly right. Thank you. Great. Okay, so I'm not seeing any more questions. So I think we can call it. I will hand it off to Kat to quickly conclude us. But otherwise, thank you everyone for joining. And we will be sending out the press release shortly. So y'all should all get it, and that'll have the report link in it again. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much, Jackie. And thank you so much for everyone who joined today. Also, really want to give another special thanks to our partners at New Georgia Project for helping co-host this press event with us, but really just also want to thank Candace, Tamrit, and Maggie for telling your stories, and just like a reminder again that the South has something to say, and just really lifting up the fact that this relief would be life-changing. We know how meaningful it is, and we know how deeply it affects, again, the broader Atlanta community, student loan borrowers, but especially Black borrowers across the city and Metro Atlanta Bay Area. And again, just uplifting what Aisa said, we know their efforts to overturn this relief, but we're just going to keep talking about it. We're going to keep telling our stories because we know how powerful it is when we tell our stories, when we talk about the effects of student debt in our community. So thank you so much again for everyone joining today. Thanks. Have a great day.